I just experimented with an amazing watercolor technique that is a complete game changer, and the best is I haven't really seen anyone use this before. These probably look familiar to you. They're Faber-Castell graphite pencils, and the twist here is that these are also available in the form of water-soluble pencils. Many people think that water-soluble and watercolor pencils are mostly useful for sketching before watercoloring, and I've been working hard on this channel for the past 6 months to show what these type of pencil can really do. But I had totally missed out on this technique that is completely changing my art right now. So in fact, you can use these for an elaborate sketch and even in a painting, and the result is just wow when done right, as you can see with this super cute squirrel I painted the other day. But before I show you how it works with watercolor, here is a quick demo of how the pencils work. In this graphite aquahead tin by Faber-Castell, there are 5 water-soluble pencils, HB, 2B, 4B, 6B, and 8B. And that indicates they're pretty soft pencils, except for the HB, a hard black pencil. And that's the one you would want to use for sketching if you were to do things like everyone else does them. As for the other 4 pencils, you can see how much more rich the graphite actually looks and how much more opaque the pigment gets. 8B being the softest of them all, and the one we will be using last in a regular watercolor pencil style painting to add the darkest and deepest shadows. So to use such pencils effectively for watercolor, you want to make sure they aren't too hard, and with these Faber-Castell pencils, you'll be fine, because you see when I activate these with a little bit of water, I'm seeing already that the coverage will be great and that their sharp tip will also help with fine details. Now, a cool thing to remember about these graphite water-soluble pencils in particular is that you can also erase them pretty nicely. The eraser doesn't entirely remove the blended graphite, but it's good for subtle highlights. On graphite that wasn't blended, here the 2B, I see it's working even better. Now it's time to show you the magic that you can get with these pencils, because besides the squirrel painting, I really surprised myself with even more techniques to the point that I'm really rethinking my style. The squirrel illustration had no background, no heavy washer paint, and I mostly used other watercolor pencils with my watercolor techniques. I also experimented on a portrait painting, which you can find on my Patreon in real time, and I'll add a link to my description of the video for this. After all that, I wanted to apply it to a full watercolor painting, and I merged these 2 photos to try it. I had tried it first on another project by adding the graphite first, then the watercolor, but it was a total mess since I was working on wet. And the graphite dirtied the watercolors and made them all dull, so I decided to do it the other way around. So first I sketched the bird, but I knew to do it with a regular pencil, so the water-soluble pigments from the other kind don't smudge later. Because maybe you can see it, but even regular pencils tend to dissolve a little bit and it's not great. So the lesson here is to avoid pencils before working wet on wet or using a very hard kind. I started with my regular watercolor process, just painting my bird. My goal was to keep the vibrancy from these colors, the bright blues in that background, and then the bright greens in the moss. I also had nice golden browns in my bird and white parts that I wanted to preserve, so I just painted like I always do to start. Notice I even took care to start adding shadows, because in my realistic painting style, great but gradual contrast is important, and I didn't want to build that contrast up with graphite only, because I imagine it would be very dull if I did it that way. And you might rightfully wonder why I even bothered with water-soluble graphite pencils and not the Derwent Graphitint water-solubles, since they're a mix of graphite and color after all. And that is only because with the Graphitint, the effect is very subtle, as you can see from these 2 paintings that I made with them. You might be able to tell colors are not as bright as regular watercolor pencils, but not that different either. It just renders paintings that are more muted, but I want to show you what the graphite-only watercolor soluble pencils can do in comparison, and you'll see it's just very different. So once my painting was finished, instead of calling it a day, I went and I started emphasizing the shadows where I wanted them. And not just the shadows, but also fine details. The kind of details that would be very hard to get with watercolor and a very thin paintbrush. I worked on defining the feathers a bit more and all the dark areas like the eye, the beak, and shadows in the bird and the branch. I even added small twigs with the pencils, which is a huge plus when you use this medium. The fact that you can get details, but also texture and contrast all at once. And now maybe you're thinking that I could have used the paint spray or black watercolor paint instead of the pencils. But let me tell you that the effects is not just the same. It just lacks the rustic, aged looks that the water-soluble graphite pencils have, and I much prefer that kind of aged look as far as I'm concerned, and it really makes watercolor painting a bit different too. And we're not done because after I activated all the additions I brought for the pencils, I wanted to make my background more mysterious. So I used this favorite watercolor pencil technique of mine on the water-soluble graphite pencils because they work just the same. So I just scribbled on a palette with a rough texture and I was able to get a smooth puddle of paint. And look at how absolutely gorgeous this was looking on paper. The paper was wet, so I even added more twigs directly on the wet paper with a pencil. And it was amazing. It was so effective to do it that way, as you can clearly see, I think. And with a range of pencils that we have with the Faber-Castell set, you could add additions that are more or less dark. So it's up to you to choose what effect you want. I went with the darkest pencils because I really wanted that darker look. Shadows are very important, but so are highlights. So I added a few of them with a white colored pencil and a white gel pen. And by the way, you can find all of my supplies neatly categorized in the description of this video if you need them. I love how much more pronounced the effect is when you use these water-soluble graphite pencils over dark watercolor paint or just the graphited pencils. It's a great way to add shadows, but also details and texture all at once. So let me know in the comments if I should make those tutorials on my Patreon and more here on YouTube as well, because I think I'm in love. I'll link my growing watercolor pencil playlist right here if you need to learn more techniques. And I'll see you in the next video. Thank you so much for watching.